Okay, class. In this lecture, we're going to be talking about cardiac valve disease, which are diseases and disorders to the valves of the heart. You may also see this referred to as valvular disease, but we're really talking about the same thing. Now, in this lecture, we'll get into some of the normal anatomy and physiology, and this is important because a lot of the clinical manifestations of cardiac valve disease are just due to abnormalities of this normal pathway of blood flow through the heart. So it's good just to kind of cover a little refresher on what is normal, so we can appreciate some of the changes that occur with these different conditions. And then we'll get into various different types of valve disease. It's actually something that's pretty common in older populations. Again, as we've discussed throughout this series of lectures, throughout this course, that we often see an older population, and again, this is a pretty common thing that we see in older patients, particularly certain types, and we'll get into this, and then how it impacts clinical practice, notably exercise tolerance, and then we'll spend a little bit of time talking about auscultation. So, well, would be remiss if I didn't touch on the Whip-and-Wasserman gas exchange gear again, which describes the dynamic interplay between the cogs of the muscular system or peripheral muscular system, the circulatory system, and the ventatory system. And again, remembering anytime we have changes, right, or any of these cogs work a little less or don't work as well, we see the other sides have to work a little bit harder to maintain cardiac output, to maintain exercise capacity, as well as to maintain, which is characterized by VO2, as well as to expire gases. So, if we see, detriments, for example, which we'll talk about here in cardiac valves, which affect the circulatory system, quite often we'll see impairments in ventilation or things in the ventatory system, and may actually impair, or make the muscles have to work a little bit harder in a certain sense, because we may impact perfusion to the muscles. We'll get into this stuff a little bit later. So again, just a reminder of pathways of blood through the heart. So again, blood returns from the periphery to the heart through the venous system, and they enter into the heart through the vena cava. So we have our superior and inferior vena cava, which dump into the right atrium on the right side of the heart, which passes through the right AV valve, the right atrial-ventricular valve, which is also known as a tricuspid valve. And then that blood continues through into the right ventricle, through the pulmonic trunk into the pulmonary artery, which it returns to the lungs to be oxygenated. And then blood returns from the lungs to the heart through the pulmonary veins. You remember, arteries always move blood away from the heart. Veins always bring blood back to the heart. So even though these are oxygenated, they're still coming back to the heart. So they're technically called veins, even though they're really, if we look at the histology, they're more like arteries. But I digress. So pulmonary veins enter into the left atrium, passes through the left AV valve, also known as the bicuspid valve, and then it passes through into the left ventricle to be pumped out of the left ventricular outflow tract into the aorta, where it goes through our great vessels and out to the rest of the body. So again, at any point, right, we can have detriments to this flow of blood, right? So either at the AV valves, which are here, are tricuspid and mitral valves, or the semilunar valves, which we actually didn't even mention. So we've got our pulmonic valve here on the right circuit, or the pulmonic circuit here. And then we have our aortic valve as well, which is kind of our block. Can't really see it too well here on the left side. Now, these are important because these valves, in a certain sense, allow us to pressurize the chambers of the heart, notably the ventricles, right and left ventricles, to overcome the pressure downstream, right? And they only open when the pressure downstream or the pressure upstream in the chamber is higher than the pressure downstream. So again, we've got our semilunar valves here, pulmonic, and our atrial aortic valves. And remembering that during diastole, right, both our aortic and pulmonic, or the semilunar valves, are closed, right, because we're filling. The heart isn't contracting, it's relaxed. Remember, it actually unwinds a little bit. There's actually a little bit of negative pressure, which helps suck these back down. And this, during that period, the chordae tendon, or the AV valves, right, tricuspid and mitral, are actually open, right, because we're filling, right? Those valves are open, right? And blood's moving through the atria, moving into the ventricles, filling both. Now, during systole, our tricuspid and mitral valves are closed, right? The atria contract, and then we've got the closure of these valves, which helps keep the pressure in the ventricles, or helps increase the pressure because we keep the volume fixed, right? Then as we contract and contract, we eventually create enough pressure to allow the semilunar valves to open, the aortic and the pulmonic, and blood egresses out of the heart. So again, just a little review of some physiology. Again, heart valves, passive structures, they respond to pressure changes. When contraction increases pressure within a given chamber. So again, we're talking, notably, we're talking about the ventricles. If it's greater than the downstream pressure, so if we can create pressure in the ventricles greater than what it is in the aorta, or greater than what it is in the pulmonary artery or pulmonic trunk, the valve's going to open. And quite often when contraction ends, pressure decreases, right, because we're relaxing. And the downstream pressure is now, again, higher than it is in the chamber, and the valve closes. So it's always, again, this back and forth between pressures. Again, these aren't, these are passive elements, the chordae tendineae and papillary muscles, which you guys, maybe thinking, well, wait a minute, there's muscles that attach to the AV valves. Those are really designed, if you guys can remember, they're really designed to kind of keep these shut, right? The chordae tendineae basically act as like tent lines to keep these shut during systole, because if these open, right, we lose pressure. And some of the valve disorders are due to those changes. So again, pressure rules. So again, AV valves, our left side, bicuspid or mitral. Our right side is our tricuspid, because it has 3 leaflets. The chordae tendineae and the papillary muscles are really there, again, because if we look at what happens during, the beginning of systole, these shut, right? These are going to be shut, and we need something to keep these taut from flapping open. We don't want these to open. We want these to be closed so that we have a fixed volume as the heart contracts, right? We're building more and more pressure, and eventually, enough to open up these valves in the pulmonary valve and the aortic valve, right? So again, it's really critical that these stay closed so we can keep a closed system and only let blood move out of this direction. If we start losing, pressure and blood starts eking out, then we start losing potentially cardiac output, because we lose some stroke volume that jets back into the aorta, and it makes the ventricles have to work a little bit harder because they have to create more pressure, more contractile force, because the volume, right, is a little bit larger. So again, that old Boyle's law equation. And again, just remember that these chordae tendineae are really working against this force, because when the ventricles contract, there's going to be a higher pressure, right, in this chamber, right, than the atria. The atria are going to be at a much lower pressure. So if these chordae tendineae really have to do their job to keep these AV valves from flapping back open. If they flap back open, we're going to end up having some pressure shoot into the atria and not, through this valve and downstream. So again, it's really important that those chordae tendineae, papillary muscles are well maintained, right, aren't damaged. And actually what can happen after an MI, if you got a really large septal MI, sometimes you can get death of the papillary muscles, and you end up having a little bit of regurgitation. You get some blood back. These valves aren't as strong. And our semilunar valves, again, named due to their half moon morphology. They kind of look like a half moon. Left side's aortic, right side's pulmonic. 3 left leaflets on each. Again, they don't have the papillary tendineae, and they don't really lie back against the walls, kind of like our AV valves. So when they're open, they're kind of flush against the ventricles. These kind of close in this fashion, almost like they almost like kind of form back into each other. So they open up when the pressure, again, in the ventricles are greater than it is downstream. So our goal is to create enough pressure in these ventricles higher than the downstream pressure, either in the pulmonary artery or in the aorta. And then again, if this pressure is higher, these valves will open. As we begin to relax, and we start losing pressure in these chambers, these will eventually close because of there's still pressure, in those chambers causing those valves to close. Now, again, just remembering the differences and whether the valves are going to be open and closed during systole and diastole. Again, this is just a review of physiology. This is stuff we covered last semester. And again, at any step along the way with the blood flow through the heart, any of the valves being open when they're supposed to be closed or closed when they're supposed to be open is going to impact cardiac output, which then may impact exercise capacity. It may also impact pressure, right, against certain parts of the heart. So again, we'll get into different conditions and some of the symptoms that we see with valve disease, but it all goes back to pressure, right? Again, that concept of pressure rules. So we'll end here, and next we'll get into different conditions.